to our second session of the day. The first presentation, as I mentioned, will be by Dr. Aaron Amankwa, and that will continue with our discussion with DNA databases. And then we're going to go into disaster victim identification and have a panel that is really going to explore strategies to explore the deceased in DVI cases and cases of unidentified human remains. So without carrying on further, I want to introduce you to Dr. Aaron Amankwa. He's an assistant professor in forensic sciences at Northumbria University and has an academic background in forensic biology and research experience in DNA profiling as well as DNA legislation and policy, which you could tell from the interactions on the panel just before tea, how experienced and knowledgeable Aaron is. I actually, the first time I met Aaron was through a Zoom call, and it was as a result of the many publications that Aaron has published. And we got chatting, and again, he's actually a colleague on the Africa policy board that we've created together, where we are trying to implement policies, not implement policy, but suggest frameworks for legislative policies in Africa that other countries could adopt or certainly use as templates towards their own legislative development. And this is really what Aaron is going to be speaking about. And we are very grateful that you are here, because last week when I asked Stephen, so has Aaron's visa been issued? And we realized that the South African High Commission in London hadn't issued it yet. And it looked like he actually wasn't going to be able to get on his flight. So in a last desperate attempt on Friday afternoon, I phoned London High Commission office, and somebody picked up the phone and said, hello. And I thought, hello, is that the London High Commission? He said, yes. He said, I don't know why I've just randomly picked up the phone because the assistant who's here is not at her desk. I said, well, please, can you help me? It turned out that this guy actually was the guy to speak to from DIRCO. And I told him the situation, and I said, you have to help us. Apparently, all the systems were down, so they weren't issuing visas to anybody coming to South Africa. And it wasn't, if it wasn't for Grant, thank you, wherever you are now, and I have sent him an email with a photograph of us together, Aaron, actually going physically and saying, you have to issue the visa for this guy to get here. And on Friday night, Aaron messaged us and said, phoned him, he's got the visa. So you made it, we're here, and we are so excited that you can present in person, because it would not have been the same as having you online. Thank you so much, and over to you.
Okay, hello everyone. Thanks Vanessa for that introduction. I think first of all, I would like to thank Stephen and Vaughn, and there's another person, Mathilde Mohammed, Vanessa, for all your, what you went through. I don't know what you did, but for whatever you did for me to be here in person and join this discussion, I am very grateful. And hello everyone online and everyone here as well. So this project really started following a discussion with Vanessa, and the Forensic DNA Policy Board was formed with other colleagues, and our intention is to develop a forensic DNA legislative framework and policy for Africa that could serve as a template for nations that intend to develop a legislative framework and policy as well. So in my discussion, first of all, I think my colleagues have done a fantastic job explaining what forensic DNA is, what DNA databases are. So I think I'll start off my presentation with the value of forensic DNA coupled with a DNA database. I will also talk about the status of forensic DNA profiling and databases across Africa. And then I will describe the importance. I think I referenced that point in response to the question asked by Linda, and the importance of harmonization of the different legislations that we have and policies to regulate the use of forensic DNA. I'll then talk about specifically the UK National DNA Database and some of the developments there. I feel that it is important that we are aware of it because they have a very rich sort of development in terms of legislation and policies, and some of the lessons that we can learn from some of the challenges that they have faced over the years. And then I'll talk about the importance of regulation of the use of forensic DNA, and I'll also suggest a potential model that we could follow in developing our own legislative frameworks and policy as well. Now, one of the big lessons that I learned from my PhD supervisor is that it's always great to start off your presentation with what your conclusion will be, so that in case you're not able to follow me to the end, you know what the sort of end point of my presentation is. And there are three key things that key messages that I want to emphasize in my talk. The first one is that without adequate forensic DNA legislative frameworks and policies, an innocent person could go to jail, or a true offender may go scot-free. So it is very important that we have appropriate laws to govern the use of forensic DNA. The second point that I also want to emphasize is that without adequate legislation and policies, the human rights of innocent individuals and generally everyone could be infringed upon. So it is very important that we have appropriate laws to govern the use of DNA evidence and databases. The third point that I also want to emphasize is that harmonization of legislation and policies, and also the technical procedures that are used, for example, a core loci that is used in DNA profiling is very crucial, especially because the world is going along the aspect of the transnational exchange of forensic DNA data. Now, even though we have the Interpol database, if the core loci we are using is different from that of another country, it may not be possible for us to detect any hits. So it is very important that we harmonize the legislation, the procedures, and the core loci and so on that we have in our various countries. Okay, so I'll start off just by explaining a case example to highlight the point of the importance of forensic DNA analysis coupled with the national DNA database. And this case example is a very good case that illustrates how relevant national DNA databases could be, or the crucial role they can play in an investigation. So in 1988, the rape of a 27-year-old woman in York, back in England, went unsolved because no suspect was identified in that particular case. In 1997, there were a series of burglaries involving women underwear and jewelries in a town called Beverley, also in England. This case also went unsolved because no suspect was identified in that particular investigation. So subsequently and more recently, the Cleveland and North Yorkshire Major Investigation Team carried out a cold case review to review the evidential material from that particular case. And I think one of my colleagues mentioned the importance of storing forensic material. And this is one case example that illustrates the importance of doing just that. So in this particular case, the investigators found a semen stain on the skirt of the victim from the rape incident back in 1988. So the DNA was extracted from the stain, and they were able to generate a DNA 17 profile, which is simply examining 16 parts of the STR regions and including the amelogenin locus as well. So this profile was then subsequently uploaded in the National DNA Database in 2017, and it generated a hit to the DNA profile of this man called Andrew Pennington. His DNA profile was already on the database due to a previous incident that he was involved in. He was subsequently arrested, charged, and then he was sentenced to 10 years in prison in 2018, almost 30 years since this particular incident happened. So this shows you how crucial forensic DNA analysis coupled with the national DNA database could assist an investigation. So I'll then move on to talk about the situation in Africa currently. So I try to draw a map just to illustrate this, and based on publicly available information. So Interpol publishes this data on DNA profiling survey among their member countries, and usually limited number of countries respond to this particular survey or release the information. So it is very difficult getting information, especially from Africa. And from the recent data that they published, around 11 countries in Africa are currently carrying out DNA profiling. And I've color-coded these in the image that you can see on my slide. Now, among these countries, 9 of them have reported operating a national DNA database, and I've colored that green, as you can see on the slide as well. So we have Morocco, we've got Algeria, Egypt, Sudan, Namibia, we've got Botswana, we've got South Africa, and we've also got Mauritius, who are operating a national forensic DNA database currently. So what this tells us is that the use of DNA profiling and DNA databases across the continent is very, very limited. And we have to do something about it, probably. Now, I was able to get some data as well, publicly available information, but I've realized from the talk by one of my colleagues, Mr. Anthony Wali, I realized that Botswana's database has really grown significantly since the data that I could find online. But currently, there are around 1.3 million forensic DNA profiles held in the region, with South Africa contributing more than 90% of those profiles. Now, what you can see is that there are some countries like my original country, Ghana, which have color-coded. We are also using DNA profiling. We don't have a national DNA database, although the police have still started collecting profiles. So there are around 1,193 profiles, at least, held in Ghana, although we don't have a specific law and a national DNA database as well. So I've given a breakdown of some of the data that I could find currently on the number of profiles held in other countries. But the flag here that the Interpol document that was published, some countries did not respond to the survey, or they did not give authorization for the release of any of that data. So at least these are the potential sort of countries and data that we have currently. But what I want to emphasize is that DNA profiling and the use of national DNA databases across the continent is very limited. And just to give you a global perspective, currently there are around 83 countries operating a national intelligence forensic DNA database. And there are a few countries that are planning to establish one as well. And what you can see across Africa, we have about 9 of them. In Asia, there are 17 of them, and based on size, China has the largest DNA database in the world with almost 60 million profiles held in the database. Then we have Europe. What you can see here is that almost all countries in Europe have a national DNA database. And in terms of the size or the population, the percentage of the population in the database, the UK has the largest database based on the proportion of the population, almost 9% of the population, and it has around 7 million profiles currently. Then when we look at North and South America as well, there are 15 countries, around 15 countries with a national intelligence DNA database, and the United States has the largest database with almost more than 18 million profiles held currently. In Australasia, we have Australia and New Zealand, they have a database as well. Now, one of the growing trends in the proliferation of national DNA databases is the transnational exchange of DNA data, which I highlighted at some point in my response to one of the questions. Now, the transnational exchange of forensic DNA data is very important in fighting cross-border crime, which is becoming very common in the days, things like smuggling of firearms, human trafficking, and so on. So in this particular paper that I've highlighted on the slide is a paper I published some years ago, And I describe 3 specific models that are used in the transnational exchange of DNA data. One of them is the establishment of an international DNA database, like the Interpol database that we have, which currently has around 280,000 profiles from 87 countries, as my colleague mentioned earlier. We also have regional international databases. For example, there's one operated by Europol as well, which is another example where different countries can upload profiles into the international database and they can share information. Another model is the networked databases. And one good example is the PRUM framework, which I also mentioned as well. And then the last model is the request-based, where you can request due to bilateral agreements between multiple countries, you can request for searching of a database, for example, and share DNA data. But they all have their own limitation. The request-based system takes a very long time to exchange any DNA information, for example. And I have highlighted the EU PRUM framework because I think that that is the approach that we can take, especially as we are starting across Africa, to develop policies and also to develop legislation in this particular area. So the EU PRIM framework is a network of separate national DNA databases of member states. And it involves the exchange of forensic DNA, finger marks or fingerprints, and vehicle registration information. So the PRUM Treaty was originally signed by 7 EU countries in 2005. In 2008, it was adopted into EU law, and this framework requires all member states to create a database that can be accessed by other member states as well. So currently, excluding the UK, there are around 7 million subject profiles and about 1 million crime scene profiles. But the UK is a participant in the framework and they have the largest database. So there are more than 14 million profiles that can be accessed within this system with different caveats. One of the major limitations with this particular framework that they have is the lack of harmonization of legislation and policies. And that can infringe on the efficient exchange of any forensic DNA data. Even the Interpol and Europol databases, they are all reliant. The exchange of DNA data is still based on national laws of the participating countries. So without harmonization of legislation and forensic DNA policies, it can still be very difficult for us to exchange forensic information. And one of the key recommendations I will make is that for what we are trying to achieve with the Forensic DNA Policy Board is to develop a framework that we can continue with discussions with EU so that it can be adopted into law and we can create a common harmonized legislation across Africa to facilitate the exchange of DNA information and other forensic information as well. And just to highlight why the exchange of forensic DNA data is important, I chose this case example, which is reported in one of the reports of the DNA Strategy Board, the UK. I thought it was a very good example to illustrate the importance of the transnational exchange of forensic DNA data. Now, in April 2018, there was an importation from the Netherlands to Dover, which is also in the UK. And they seized 6 firearms, which were concealed in the car. And they also found ammunition, which were wrapped in brown tape in that importation. Subsequently, in September 2018, another importation also from the Netherlands was seized as well. And here they seized 10 Heckler & Koch P2000 semi-automatic firearms and around 200 rounds of live compatible ammunition as well in this particular importation. So the police were able to recover trace DNA material from the weapons and the packaging, and this led to the identification of 2 brothers, one of them who was already wanted. So Daniel Bedet, who was present at both scenes, and Richard Bedet, who was present at one of the scenes. Now, they were both residing in Holland at the time, and Daniel in particular, as I said, was on the run for about 5 years. So European arrest warrants were issued and they were arrested and retained in the UK for trial. And both of them were found guilty, with one of the brothers being handed a 25-year sentence and the other an 18-year sentence. And further DNA links were established in this case through the Prüm exchange system to incidents in France and the Netherlands as well. And this demonstrates how important the transnational exchange of forensic DNA data can be in terms of fighting against cross-border crime, including smuggling of firearms and drugs, and also human trafficking as well. So it is very important that we think beyond the national level and also consider the transnational exchange of data as well. So I think in the next few slides, I think probably because of the time, I'm sort of worried I may not be able to finish, but I want to highlight the key aspect in terms of what we need to learn about the UK National DNA Database in terms of its development and what its key performances are currently. Okay. So the main important thing that I want to highlight here is that the UK National DNA Database was established in 1995, and at the time they used what we call the 6-STR-SGM system. So it was just looking at 6 parts of the STR region plus the amelogenin locus. In 1999, they moved to the SGM plus, which looked at 10 different parts of the genome. And in 2014, we started using the DNA 17, which looks at 16 STR regions plus the amelogenin locus. In 2015, Scotland moved to DNA 24, which is looking at around 24 parts of the DNA as well. Now, the reason why there's been an increase in the number of STR regions analyzed in DNA profiling is so that we can enhance the discriminatory power of the technique and also reduce the chance of adventitious matches as well. Now, the next thing that I want to flag up here is what we call the standard core loci. So the standard set loci, and this is very, very important so that any data that is analyzed and any data we have in the UK can be exchanged with that of another country. So, and also different police forces and laboratories can also exchange data, and we can compare the DNA profiles from one laboratory to that of another. So across the UK, we have the DNA 17 system, and we look at 16 parts of the STR regions and also plus the amelogenin locus, which determines the biological sex of the individual. The United States, the CODIS system has now been expanded from 13 to around 20. But what you can see from the slide is that there is some form of equivalence. The UK shares some similar STR regions that are analyzed. And this is important so that we can share data and we will be able to determine whether profiles could match or not, for example. Across Europe, they also have this common set of loci similar to what is used in the UK as well. And what you can see is that the Interpol threshold is rather low compared to other countries, and this recognizes the differences across the countries. But at least most kits that are used use this sort of STR regions highlighted by Interpol. So it may still be possible for us to exchange and compare data as well. So the key thing that I probably want to highlight again because of the time, I'll just move on straight away to that part. All right. So currently, the UK National DNA Database holds around 7 million profiles. And based on the most recent report by the Strategy Board, this table highlights what the key performance is in terms of the number of matches. So within the last period, around 22,477 matches between a subject profile and a crime scene profile were detected. So these are matches between the reference profile of a known person and the profile from a crime scene. And the match rate of the database currently is around 65%. And the match rate is simply the proportion of crime scene profiles loaded in the database that matched a subject profile in the database. And please take note, the match rate is not an indication of the effectiveness of the database. It indicates the performance of the database generally. And remember that this is referring to cases where a crime scene DNA profile was recovered. Now, what you can see is a breakdown of the specific cases that are linked to DNA analysis. So you can see that burglary offenses is at the top, around 8,000 matches from this particular case. And this gives an indication that whatever legislation that we develop, it should not be limited to specific offenses against the person, like rape or homicide alone. We should consider property offenses as well. Probably the most important slide that I want to highlight is the impact and limitations of DNA analysis and the use of databases. Now, what you can see from this particular slide is showing you of all recorded crimes reported in a particular year. What we can see is that DNA is linked to outcome in less than 1% of all recorded crime. In fact, there are specific cases where DNA is linked to a number of offenses is in domestic burglaries and homicide cases, which moves to around 0.6% and 8.4%. What are the reasons for these results? This may probably be shocking to some of you, but there are several reasons for this. Number one, the police do not examine all crime scenes, and most crimes do not involve DNA at all. Secondly, the recovery of biological material can also be problematic as well, and also being able to recover quality DNA that can be uploaded in the database can also be a problem as well. And then there's also the probative value of DNA as well. DNA may play no role at all in some cases as well. So why then do we need legislation? So there are several reasons why we need a legislation to govern the use of DNA and national DNA databases. The first point is that although the current systems that we have are really discriminatory, especially when we are examining up to around 24 parts of the DNA, although it is discriminatory, there's still the chance of advantageous matches, especially as we are moving to the transnational exchange of forensic DNA data. And this is a case that I talked about in the media briefing, and colleagues who are interested can refer to this book, which details some of the issues surrounding the use of DNA. So there can be chance matches where the profile could match to an innocent person, and it is important that we recognize that in our legislation and policies and the interpretation of DNA evidence. There's also the issue of transfer and persistence. Although we may find DNA at a crime scene, there's no mechanism for us to be able to determine, for example, the time the DNA was deposited or whether it was deposited directly or indirectly, for example. We don't have reliable techniques for us to be able to do that. So it is very important that we interpret DNA evidence cautiously. Unfortunately, there's been instances of abbreviation of investigations. Once the police hear that there's a DNA hit, they don't carry out further investigation. But it is very important for us to recognize that other corroborative evidence is essential for us to be able to investigate a case, for example. The other issue is also about the privacy rights of individuals as well. And I will highlight this. I think my time is up, but if I still have a bit of time, I can explain that. All right. Thank you, Vanessa. Okay, so the first thing that I want to highlight, where do we start from? Why do we have to regulate, and how do we start from? And the first thing that I want to highlight is that in most European countries and across the world, they started from what one of my colleagues, who is now a professor emeritus, Professor Robin Williams, who used to be at my university, described something called the common trajectory in these countries. So they started using DNA evidence. They started thinking about establishing a DNA database and so on, and they realized that, whoa, what are the legal implications? Then we have to develop legislation for this. And that was how it started. And some countries have still not got it quite right at the moment. But one of my colleagues, Dr. Victor Toom, looking at the Netherlands system, suggested that the right place to start is have a legislation. And once you have a legislation, you can start thinking about the proper ways and legal ways to collect DNA, the uses of DNA and the retention policies for these as well. So the starting point, in my view, is start from a legislation, an appropriate legislation. And when we think about legislation, we also need regulatory bodies as well to govern the use of DNA and also databases. Then we also need to develop specific code of practice and standard, especially for aspects that require continuous review and needs to be amended as we go on using these databases. And of course, most importantly, especially as we are moving towards the transnational exchange of DNA data, it is important that laboratories involved in DNA processing are accredited to international standards like ISO 17020 and ISO 17025 for laboratory processing. So we have to think about accreditation as well across Africa. Then of course, we also need systems to enforce the laws and the codes, and it must be subjected to periodic reviews as new systems develop. So a paper that we published recently, we detail some of the principles that should govern these legislation policies. And we talk about the principle of integrity, trustworthiness, and effectiveness as well. And you can refer to this paper for more details about that. And probably the next important part of my talk, and I'm happy that I still have some time to talk about this. Oh, okay. So I guess I have to conclude on this note, but I think I did a good thing by highlighting what my conclusion would be. So everybody knows what my conclusion is at this point. So if you need more information about my research, you can obviously get in touch and we can continue on with the talk. So thanks for listening.
Sorry, but the last time we were in Nairobi, thank you so much for your informative talk. I cut Stephen's presentation short, and I can't do that again to him. But this just shows us that we need a lot more of these events, and there is just so much expertise here and so much to say. And it was incredibly interesting listening to your perspectives. And also having worked now in the UK, which has one of the oldest DNA databases, and having that perspective, Aaron, I think really positions you so well to assist African countries develop their forensic platforms, because you also have the African context, which is so important. So please don't stay there for too long, and please come back to Africa soon. So Mr. Stephen Fonseca is the manager of the ICRC's African Center for Medico-Legal Systems, and his career includes 25 years in medico-legal death investigations. Stephen has extensive experience working with missing persons and the dead, including unidentified bodies in conflict, migration, and disasters, which we all know is so prevalent within Africa. And Stephen was also a coroner in Canada for 16 years before joining the forensic team at the ICRC. More than that, okay, besides which he's also a comedian. I didn't mention last night we had a magician and we had a dancer and a singer, but we have a comedian. And if any of you haven't seen Stephen in full swing, then stick around after the event, because I'm sure he'll regale you. And in the frenetic build-up to any event where things get really busy, Stephen never fails. He always has a sense of humor, and you can always see him on any Zoom call in the background gesticulating to me, like, oh my God. And, when Nakama and I are in the same room and, like, oh my goodness, these two strong women, what am I going to do? You always, keep us laughing. But much, much more than that, you are a constant reminder to me and to many people as to how compassionate we should be and the dignity that we need to show the dead and the families of the deceased. And you really are a true humanitarian, and it's been a great pleasure getting to know you. You've got the biggest heart I think I've ever seen in any person. And thank you for your support in this event. Thank you for always being so enthusiastic. And we're really looking forward to hearing your talk, which is going to be around identification and conflict and war. So thanks, Stephen.
I knew that it wasn't true. I've seen you at work. So I start off my presentation with this watch. I took advantage of the Grim Reaper of time and called my wife and said, I'm terrified I'm going to be late and I'm going to go the amount of time. And this was in duty free. And I thought Swiss Precision would keep me within the 30 minutes. So thanks, Vanessa. My wife approved the purchase of this watch because of you. So thanks a lot. I will be quick. I'm going to kind of change your scenario a little bit because we're going to go into conflict and all the great work that forensic scientists actually contribute towards the identification of the dead and the resolution of the missing in conflict. And let's just bear in mind, we are talking hundreds of thousands of people. There are events that I've been contacted about where it's just one incident is about 30,000 dead people, dead soldiers lying out there. There are places where I've walked along a conflict area and there's just skeletons everywhere and uniforms and sometimes small little skulls of child soldiers. So we have to keep in mind that forensics is incredibly important for criminal investigations, but it's equally important for humanitarian casework. So I'm going to move very quickly. I thought, and I was not involved in this project, wish I was, but I thought this really captures what ICRC is about and how important it is to keep using forensic science as a means of resolving cases. The Falklands War, for everybody who wasn't around at that time, sadly was a territorial dispute between Argentina and England. It's not that well known, but I think what happened in 2016 really shows the importance of DNA in a multidisciplinary approach and the importance of pursuing humanitarian efforts. What we have is a conflict or a territorial dispute very close to Argentina. I'm sure you've heard of the Falklands Islands, very cold place. And what happened in that 74 days of conflict was basically the death of 255 British combatants and 649 Argentinian combatants. And whenever soldiers die, there is always going to be a number of them that are unidentified. They are not going home, likely. Their families often don't even know they're dead. And some families will live forever never having any word as to what happened to them. They're dumped in mass graves, they're buried in common graves, their families don't get a death certificate. So the unidentified component of these types of cases has a very long effect, a very protracted effect on families of the combatants. So I'm here to represent a little bit of the combatant side that we sometimes forget because we're always talking about civilian personnel. What is incredible about this story is that in 1982, when the event unfolded, there was a British colonel who saw these bodies not as bodies, but as people. And so he did comply with international humanitarian law, and he did follow the rules, and he buries people like he was supposed to do, and these are the enemy soldiers. It's easy for us to accept that your own dead are going to be buried and respected, but we work all over the world and see dreadful inhumanity against the enemy, mutilation, burning, discarding of the bodies, leaving them out there for the animals to eat, and deliberately using them as psychological warfare. So in 1982, there was a colonel who recognized how important it was to follow the rules. That led to us to be able to apply forensic science today and ensure that those families got their loved ones back. So many of these burial sites had the unknown soldier, only known to God, and that allowed the experts to come back and look for those who were never identified and ensure that their families would actually get some results. What's often forgotten in a forensic process, and I certainly didn't learn this back at school, We were never taught about the humanitarian impact of forensics. And the fact that most of my life in forensics has been dealing with the living, not the dead. It's dealing with families, it's dealing with community, it's helping them get through the worst day, the worst month, the worst year of their life. And that takes a hell of a lot more skill than sometimes dealing with the science, because you're dealing with personalities. It's really, really hard for them. Think about, and I hope no one's experienced this, but think about just losing, if you've got a child, losing your child in a supermarket for 10 seconds, and your body goes hot, the adrenaline kicks in, you're terrified, where is my child? Now multiply that by 10 years, 20 years, 3 decades, 4 decades. I've identified people back to the 60s in the 2000s. They've been looking that entire time for their loved one. So what we have to do is we really have to consider culture, religion, tradition, rituals. Everything must be considered as we start to develop a forensic process. There's no shortcuts to the identification process, just like there's no shortcuts in your DNA lab. You have to follow every possible opportunity to get as much information that will lead to a timely identification. In these cases that we're talking about, historical cases, it's really hard because the bodies have decomposed, they've degraded, there's a lot of fragmentation, etc., which means you've got to go above and beyond. You've got to bring the best experts in. You really need to know what you're doing. We often get countries asking for some guidelines to do an exhumation. It takes more than guidelines to do a proper exhumation. You need experts, you need equipment, you need experience. You don't know what's going to be, are the bodies a foot down, are they 6 foot down? How many bodies are commingled in there? People don't understand how complicated it is when you have to start going back in time to recover information. When you're exhuming bodies, you don't just take a sample for DNA, because DNA should never be used on its own to make an identification. You will make mistakes. There are going to be errors along the way. You always want to make sure that you're using a multidisciplinary approach and you challenge the evidence. You're making sure that you did make an honest mistake. You're always inherently biased. If you have a heart, you want to help the family that call you every day, that are crying on the phone, they can't send their children to school because there's no money, because they didn't get a death certificate, they don't get a pension, they don't get benefits. So you want to make the ID, but you have to follow the science. Secondary information is so important, incredibly important, because the same reason. You also have to explain at the end of the day how you identify that person. And many people in the world, they've heard of DNA, but they're not going to understand it. But they will understand that you found their ID card, that they had some charm in their pocket, that they had a rosary with a particular feature on it. Those are the kind of things that families are looking for. You're looking for the DNA, you're looking for the science in addition to all of that, but they're more likely going to believe some of the personal effects that are found before the DNA. In Canada, when we started developing the identification program, because we found that we were biased, we want to make identifications, we get very desperate to help families, we also started that review process, the peer review process. I could never make an identification without actually presenting it, almost like a mock court, on why I thought I've met the threshold. Because remember, identification is never 100%. It's my confidence level as an expert to determine whether I've reached enough to ensure that it cannot be anybody else. So it's so important for us to have that peer review process and to look at everything. We certainly want to make sure that there are no unexplainable discrepancies in our whole logic system there. Humanitarian forensic action doesn't mean any reduction in scientific rigor. Just because the case is not going to court doesn't mean to say that you're not following the strict principles that lead to the process of identification. In fact, you want to be just as strict, because you should be able to justify or argue with your peers how you reached that decision. And there's nothing worse, and unfortunately I've seen it. Families were given a body, they went through the funeral process, they buried the body, and then 3 weeks later, the authorities came back and said, oops, that's not your body. You have to give it back. And we don't actually have your one. We're still trying to find your body. There was no reason to be put in that position. There's no reason to make a misidentification. If you follow the science and you follow the rigors of going through this process, you will not make that mistake, because sometimes you just don't identify the body. There just isn't enough information, and you don't give the body to a family unless you're absolutely certain. So I'll go back to Colonel Cardoza, who was commended, and he should be, because in many places of the world, a colonel in the military is not following this rule, not following IHL, but he did. And that allowed us to ultimately work with the two authorities, England and Argentina, as an intermediary, bring forensic experts. 122 Argentinian graves were opened, the bodies were exhumed, and after 40 years, 38 years, those people were identified and their families were notified. 40 years, it's a long time, but at least the governments kept the dispute aside and said, it's a humanitarian imperative. These families have waited enough time. Let's get these unidentified soldiers identified. DNA was critically important to that. We got to admit that if there wasn't DNA, we might not have met those thresholds today. So we can't undermine the power of DNA. It is so, so important in that multidisciplinary process. The engagement with families becomes incredibly important, because we need them both to provide the information, but to accept the identification afterwards. So they're constantly involved. So listen, let's not take credit for the fact that we recognize the importance of identification on the battleground. This was actually recognized in 1870 at least. So our founder, the ICRC, of ICRC, Henry Dunant, he was in conflict and recognized that bodies were left there that would not be identified. They had no identification. And so they would be left out there and their families would never get word. They'd never know what happened to their loved ones. So it's a long time ago. Today, what the ICRC is pushing, and certainly with the African Center of Medico-Legal Systems in Africa, which I manage, we are pushing very heavily that the military take more responsibility for collecting all this information for comparison before people are deployed. It's not even expensive. It's about standardizing and centralizing a form, creating a basic database, collecting a DNA sample, fingerprints, and having a record of where medical records and dental records can be reached quickly. That's what it takes to stop soldiers from going missing. Really, that's what it takes. And yet there are thousands and thousands and thousands of families who have never heard word from their loved one. They disappeared on the battlefield across the world. So it's so important that we keep pushing for this. The military establishments often don't have forensic expertise. So it's only when something happens that they realize the challenge that they're facing. So it's important that we impart our wisdom from the public sector, from what you're doing every day in your regular casework, onto the military, so that they start to prepare themselves in the event that somebody's going to die. And in conflict, people die, let's be honest. So the challenge, very quickly, it's important for us to look at the fact that even if it all goes well, we collect all this information, sometimes it's still not possible, or it isn't, that the families are not going to get word immediately. Often it's around failure to apply IHL, international humanitarian law. Sometimes this is deliberate. They just don't want to follow it, or there's some nefarious reason not to follow it. And in other cases, they just don't know. They don't know what the protocols are or what the practices are to be able to meet this. So it's not always us looking, saying, non-compliance, this must be some sort of nefarious reason. We've taught many military establishments and a lot of stakeholders about IHL. We do it every day in conflict so that people understand what it is. But a large-scale event with many dead people means a lot of people that need to be recovered respectfully and with dignity, and sometimes that's incredibly difficult. That can take months, that can take years. Iraq-Iran offensive is 1 million people that were left out there, were buried, that would need to be identified. I mean, this is enormous numbers of people. In some cases, the delay in the recovery definitely accelerates or decreases the ability for recognition. And so sometimes soldiers just aren't identifiable anymore if they don't have name badges, dog tags, and all of these other features so we don't have to rely on facial recognition. There's enemy of theft of enemy equipment. And I'll go back to the Boer War for the old South Africa, anybody's interested. You might remember that the British actually would execute an Afrikaans Boer soldier if he was wearing British uniforms. They thought it was too super basic to pretend to be the British and wage a sabotage or something. That wasn't it. It's that the Afrikaners actually were so cold and they didn't have replenishment of stocks that they started wearing whatever they could find just to keep warm. So people didn't quite understand why they were wearing the enemy's uniforms. There's the sharing of clothing between each other. Sometimes the name moves. Somebody's dead on the ground. You take his jacket off because you're cold and you're now wearing his name badge. When we go into battle, and somebody who's ever been in the military, you have a few pockets. You have a few things that you want to pack away. You don't have a spade. You don't have burial equipment. You have weapons. So when a number of people are killed, how are you going to suddenly bury them and ensure that you've got the GPS tracking and all? So we have to be quite practical with what soldiers are genuinely dealing with out there. Plus, they're trying to stay alive. This is obviously something that led to a number of people being killed. That's why they have to deal with the dead. They tend not to want to hang around too long to be the next one's dead. The civilian population are sometimes caught up in actually being forced to bury the dead of the enemy, and they don't have any training. They don't understand the importance of marking burial spots, collecting basic information. They're just forced to bury the dead. Bodies are commingled with unexploded ordnance. And this, as much as it's two terrible photos on the right, I'm sorry, those were mine at the time. It was 40-something degrees and extremely hot. I nearly stepped on that mortar, which was completely live. It just didn't detonate. That's after a weapons inspection through the area. So we're asking people to recover bodies in an area where they were killed. It's because there were weapons and there were explosives that went off. And so walking just through that, if one of us had bumped that little piece of silver that you see, that would have been our whole search line killed. That's how easy it is. And we lost 2 doctors, not RCRC, but 2 doctors were lost just a couple of years ago with booby trapping, where the enemy actually put hand grenades in different parts of the body. So when you pick the body up, they detonate. So when we talk about, this is the genuine reality of conflict and trying to recover bodies and identifying bodies. There's CBRNE damage. There's no forensic expertise, as I mentioned. They used, sometimes bodies are forcibly left in areas to have a psychological impact on the civilian population. If you rat us out, if you indicate where we are, you will become one of them. So we leave them there so you can notice how bad it could get for you. You comply with the new rule. That's how it works. And then sometimes, embarrassingly, we've heard that deaths are not reported by their own command so that they get the salaries of the dead person. They just don't hand them on. The senior leadership keep the salaries. So the families don't know that they were ever killed. I'm not going to go through too much of this because I think a lot of it was discussed, and you are far more educated on DNA than I am. I'm not a DNA expert, but suffice to say that DNA profiling is certainly the gold standard for mass fatality incidents in DVI. It's very important to decompose and degrade remains, but it's incredibly important in conflict because sadly, people get blown up. They're often in lots of pieces. So even taking a fingerprint or getting a dental ID is great, but what about his legs? So even when you've identified an incomplete body, you may need to take DNA because you're still waiting to get the legs reassociated with the body, or the head, or the arms, or multiple pieces. So that's really how DNA starts to become incredibly important in this process. It's a very important part of identification, but we always keep teaching and saying it's part of the search, recovery, and identification process. Don't just shoot for DNA. Don't go and just hope that you're going to find biological reference samples for DNA. You're always looking at this in the broader process of how to find someone, identify them reliably, and get this information back to the families. We've seen lots of misidentifications. Visual recognition in a disaster situation has a very high rate of failure. Families are traumatized, they'll walk into a mortuary, they'll say, yes, this is my loved one, and it absolutely is not. And they're just so traumatized, they're so desperate to find their loved one that they make mistakes. So it's important that when we go through these processes with families that we're actually maintaining the threshold of what meets an identification, and we're guiding them through this, throughout the process, and even with DNA. We don't want missed identifications, and we don't want misidentifications. I'm not going to go through this because you guys, I think Francois did a great job. It talks about our familiars a little bit, but these were notes from our genetic unit, who have a lot of experience in dealing with conflict deaths and large-scale fatalities. But suffice to say, as it's controls, policies, practices, just everything that you're probably already doing, we're trying to mobilize other laboratories around the world to do. What we have seen, and we just saw it recently in Europe, that there were missed identifications because the laboratory was not following proper protocols and practices. So I don't think I need to go through all of this. I know I can maybe save some time. We also see laboratories that are sort of established sort of in old buildings. One was a farmhouse, so the workflow doesn't quite work. Good intentions, but huge complications later, huge mistakes later, poor management of people accessing, a lack of understanding of the ISO 17025 not necessarily being accredited. And a lot of these labs are overwhelmed. When I gave you those numbers in the beginning, imagine these samples that come in, and most of them are bone, teeth, all of these more difficult samples, and now you've been suddenly required you need to get all of these reagents, you need more staff, you're overwhelmed trying to recover, help the establishment of identification. This is more my area. I can't emphasize enough the relationship of with a family. I've worked with families for years, and they are your best critic and your absolute worst critic. I mean, they are very real with you, and they know if you're genuine or not. So whenever I'm training police officers or other society members, that engagement with the family, you go and take a missing persons report, you need to understand why you're collecting the information in the first place. And especially in these cases where you're likely going to actually compare it to a body, sometimes a living body, but mostly dead. So going in and just meeting with the family for half an hour and taking a missing persons report for the sake of just documenting the missing person, they know that. They know you don't give a damn. These types of investigations and inquiries with family take 2 to 3 hours minimum, first meeting, because you're going through every single feature of their life that left an impression on the missing person's body. Do they have a fracture? Did they have a missing tooth? I know in Africa, it was mentioned, there's not a lot of dental data, but there are dental features that are still incredibly important in the early stage of searching and filtering. So you're asking every little feature, you're asking them to draw pictures of a particular scar, a tattoo, something unique. This is a long process with them. The longer you spend with them, the more information they share, and sensitive information, very sensitive information. They're not going to give you that in the first half an hour. That takes time. And sometimes it's that information that is going to help you exclude a number of cases and lead you closer towards an identification. We meet families sometimes where we haven't told them which biological relatives we actually need at the meeting. And so you waste their time. And I know it's weird to say this, but in some places, in rural communities, taking them off the farm means they're not doing something that generates food for them. So they'll come, they have to travel, they don't have much money, they catch a bus to meet you, a taxi, they sit down, and they're not the right people for your DNA collection. You've wasted their time. Now they have to go back. They have to pay for another taxi to bring another group of people. So this takes a lot of planning. It's not just going out and interviewing a bunch of people and hoping for the best, that somebody shows up that it has a usable biological reference sample. I'm nearly finished. See how quick? That was close. So I thank you very much. But again, I know a lot of you deal with the criminal cases, and the same applies. Families are everything. The relationship with the family makes or breaks your case. They share information with you. You don't own that information. And I hate seeing this jurisdictional battle between different agencies because they think they own information. You own nothing. It's the family's information. You're just borrowing it to help them make the identification because they don't have the authority to go into the databases and search the references and resources that you have at your, with your authority. So always treat them as an equal partner in the investigation, and you'll have more successful investigations. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And we'll be talking more about that in our panel discussion, which will follow the next presentation. Some people have said it's a bit hot in here. So I've asked them to put the air conditioning on. I thought it was just me, my age, but actually verification of the problem. Dino, did they say they'd put the aircon on? Yeah, otherwise we're all going to sort of fall asleep. So, Tumi, are you here? Oh, there you are. Dr. Itumeleng Molefe, we call it Tumi, is a senior lecturer in the Division of Forensic Medicine and Toxicology at UCT, the University of Cape Town, and is also a researcher and co-director of the Neuroscience Institute Brain Bank project. Tumi's current research is around violence against women and looks at the epidemiology and pathology of femicides and suspected sexual homicides in Cape Town, which actually covers a 10-year follow-up study. Am I correct? Is that your current research? And you're also involved currently with teaching and oversight of the undergraduate and postgraduate courses at UCT. Tumi's a forensic pathologist. And Tumi's involved in the Observatory Forensic Pathology Institute. This is an incredible institute, the first of its kind in Africa, I'm pretty sure. It has a holistic approach to human identification and forensic pathology. I had the great privilege of being shown around this institute when it had just been finished being built. And it truly is an incredible, incredible space. So we actually asked Professor Lorna Martin, this is her baby and her brainchild, is she here? So we have to recognize her. Hello, there you are. This amazing lady, who I used to be so terrified of. Lorna, I was so scared of you. Has asked me to present the work of her institute, and thank you both for collaborating on this, and also for Laura. I think a lot of people are scared of you, Lorna, let's be honest. But as I've got to know you, you really are a formidable woman who has done amazing things in building this together, and congratulations to you for putting this on the map in Africa, and for all the, I know the hard work that you've put into making this institute so incredible. And Tumi will tell us a little bit about it, and we also unfortunately weren't able to, we wanted to try and have a tour of it, but because they are still troubleshooting some of the areas, we weren't able to arrange that. But I believe we have a video, which is amazing, first scene here, of the institute that Tumi is going to play afterwards. So thank you very much to you both, and yes, feel free to chime in anytime as well, Lorna.
Good afternoon, colleagues. Thank you, Vanessa, for that introduction and for giving me a platform to showcase the Observatory Forensic Pathology Institute. Itumele Molefe, I am a forensic pathologist by practice, but I also have worked for many years in the clinical forensic units, or otherwise currently known as Tutuzela Center. So I have examined many victims of gender-based violence, intimate partner violence, child abuse, and rape. So it is often said that to truly appreciate where you are, sometimes it's a great idea to reflect, take a step back, reflect, and perhaps you will have a greater celebration. My purpose of my talk is to introduce you to the Observatory Forensic Pathology Institute, otherwise known as the OFPI, and I'm going to take you through a little bit of context of where we come from. We're certainly moving away from the current situation. And I'm going to focus a little bit on the burden of unidentified bodies as we see them at our current mortuary in Salt River Mortuary. And then I'm going to focus on the OFPI, highlighting the molecular lab, which will be responsible for receiving and analyzing our cases. So I currently work at Salt River Mortuary. It's one of the 16 forensic pathology facilities in the Western Cape. Our province is much larger than Botswana as a country. We have a population of just over 7.2 million people. Our facilities receive about 12,000 bodies per annum, and that number is certainly growing, is slightly higher. So Salt River Mortuary and Tygerberg Mortuary, which is attached to the University of Stellenbosch, are the two academic referral centers in the province. Together, those two institutions, which are highlighted in yellow in this map, can you see my cursor? Together, they serve a population of just over 70% of the entire province. So Salt River covers the West Metro and part of the peninsula. So as a facility, we service about almost 40% of the entire province. We are extremely busy, and I'll show you the figures just now. Our body admission rate is approximately 2 bodies per 1,000 population. We have a very good team of forensic pathologists who are extremely dedicated. We have an excellent head who's a visionary, who pushes us to work hard. But the building is debilitated, the infrastructure is old, it's just not coping, and hence the need to have another facility. So as we know, Cape Town is one of the well-run provinces in the country. And with that comes the disadvantage that most people want to come here for work or for other reasons and to settle here as families. Unfortunately, with that increasing population comes the high levels of crime. And fatalities from those crimes get admitted in our mortuary. So the problem year on year becomes greater and greater. The kind of unidentified bodies that we see at the mortuary have been previously described in literature. There was a study done in Salt River Mortuary in 2020, but the findings were very much similar to those found at Pretoria Mortuary, where Professor Blumenthal is working. The majority of our homeless and unidentified bodies are people who are characterized by poor socioeconomic conditions. And when you are struck with poverty, the families often have to choose whether they're going to use the money that they have to buy bread, to travel to the mortuary, to provide first and secondary identifiers. And this is, and I take a point that was highlighted by Stephen, but also by Tim and Nechama yesterday, that it is important to collaborate and educate the community and work together with them so that they can understand our identification process and why we need for them to come through to the mortuary. A large number of our mortuary population is also people who come to the province, like I said, for migrant labor, either from poorer provinces. For us, it's largely people from the Eastern Cape, but also from our neighboring poorer in developing countries like Malawi, Zimbabwe, and Lesotho. And therefore, it is important and crucial that we have a good collaboration with those countries so that they understand the processes that we follow to identify the disease, along with understanding what measures can be used to curb the problem. So this next slide shows the numbers of the body admissions at Salt River. The years 2010 to 2017 were taken from a study published in 2020, and I've just added the most recent years for, just to give context of how busy we are. So as you can see, our caseload is double that of Pretoria Mortuary, with about 8 to 9 forensic pathologists doing all of this work. So the numbers are in blue columns, with the top parts in orange showing the proportion of unidentified bodies year on year for the past 13 years. On average, our unidentified prevalence is from 8 to 12% at any given time. I wouldn't rejoice too much about 2020. That little drop is due to the COVID pandemic, because most people were at home and not on the streets being killed. And I don't have data for the 2021 and last year just yet. A majority of our unidentified bodies die from homicides and accidents and suicides. But over the past few years, we have recognized that most of our unidentified bodies are actually people who die from natural causes, and that really is not our mandate. Our mandate of the Forensic Pathology Service is to determine cause of death of unnatural causes and to assist the police with identification. So because of the problems with capacity and storage, and because our building, at the moment we are operating at a capacity that is double what the building can afford in terms of storage of bodies, we started declining easy admission of those bodies. So we are now engaging with undertakers and the police to say, yes, this person is unidentified, but do they actually have to come to a forensic mortuary? Can they go to a private undertaker and have the family go to a private undertaker and go and assist with identification through primary and secondary identifiers? Cape Town go through multiple seasons. Most of you are enjoying the rain, but in the summer months, it gets very hot and it can get quite humid. So in those summer months, our decomposed bodies are much more prevalent, and which places a significant risk of having unidentified bodies. We also have a big problem with people who die from fires. We have a national crisis at the moment of load shedding. In the backdrop of that problem, which is not so new, we've been having illegal electrical connections for years. And that problem presents a unique situation where burned and charred bodies cannot be identified in any other way except for scientific methods. And because of those unique situations that we encounter in our mortuary setting, we have developed a very strict systemic process of identifying our deceased. Before, we used to wait for 7 days before we could take specimens for DNA. But at the moment, if we perform an autopsy, and yes, we perform autopsies from Monday to Friday, there is no free day because there's so many bodies. But if you get to the autopsy and the body is not identified, we routinely take specimens for DNA. And obviously that will depend on the integrity of the remains. That is not to say that we send in those specimens to the lab. We actually just keep the FTA so that we don't overload the forensic science laboratory. But the reason for that is we don't want to have to go back to the fridge 3 or 4 months down the line when actually none of a family member has not come forth to offer other form of identification. The National Health Act currently allows us to bury unclaimed bodies if they are not identified within 30 days. However, And often because of the requests from investigating officers, we are having to keep these bodies for more than 90 days at the mortuary. So you can imagine the amount of strain that it places on the service. We are lucky in our current setting, and we are definitely transferring these services into the new facility, that we have access to postmortem radiology in the form of the exemplar machine. And we were one of the first owners of that machine. And it has incredibly revolutionized the way we perform postmortems. We have our own forensic odontologist, and we also have easy access to forensic anthropology at UCT, and we are able to refer cases as we see them with no delays whatsoever. So despite our efforts to partner with the Forensic Science Lab, specifically the Victim Identification Unit, who assist us with DNA analysis, but also facial reconstruction, we are not experiencing the kind of success that we would otherwise have liked, or at least hoped for. We still have bodies that are not identified and are staying in our storage facilities for more than 14 months. And so, yeah, this is clearly a problem that needs to be addressed in a more integrated and efficient manner. What we need to appreciate is that when we deal with unidentified bodies, they come from different sources, like I say, but inevitably, the load of the unidentified bodies places a higher load on the amount of DNA analysis that have to be performed. And that also fits back into the amounts of DNA analysis that have to be processed for criminal investigations. So at the mortuary, if I have a sexual homicide, for instance, or an intimate partner violence case that has possibly been strangled, and the body is not yet identified. As we know, most of these bodies are hidden, right? I mean, perpetrators do not usually disclose the whereabouts of their victims, especially where sexual crime is committed. I'm just going to pause here. Did anybody listen to the news this morning? And I'm glad that Tim did not listen to the news, because otherwise you'd have been terribly scared when you discovered few strange men in your room. So in the news, it was reported that a suspect was arrested after an autopsy revealed that his victim was stabbed and raped. But also in that episode of news, they reported a community in Khayelitsha, just across the river, serviced by Tygerberg Mortuary, that the community is complaining about the high levels of crime and the failure of government to intervene effectively. So yes, this is real. I was saying high numbers of unidentified bodies feed back into the load of other criminal cases. And for me, something that is very close to my heart, they affect the DNA analysis and results that I would want to have in court when I go to give testimony for femicide cases, but equally for other crimes as well. So I'm rushing along, but I do want to leave this slide on before I go to show you the video of the OFB. I want to just say that as a health service, so the forensic pathology service used to belong to, or at least the mortuaries used to be run by the police, but now we fall under the Department of Health. So we've looked at this problem of unidentified bodies, and we've looked at the trends, we've looked at our practice over years, and we've taken a step back, we've reflected, and we have decided to apply a whole of government and a whole of society approach. So the OFB at the moment is really a fertile ground based on the principles of multidisciplinary team approach, integration, and professionalism. So without further ado, I want to present to you, and I think this is the first public forum where you get to see the OFB, otherwise known as the castle on the ground of UCT and Groote Schuur Hospital. Ladies and gentlemen, the first Africa's Forensic Pathology Institute. The building has been strategically built right at the entrance of Groote Schuur Hospital, and I'm just gonna I won't be able to do this. I wonder if some of you, those who are familiar with Protiskia, so those who are familiar with Protiskia Hospital, you'll see that in the backdrop, as you look in the front of the OFB, you'll see the old Protiskia building, which is that white building. And on the side here is the newer building of Protiskia. And something amazing is that as you stand at the front of the OFB, you actually see a silhouette of Table Mountain. Beautiful, incredibly amazing to see. It's a 3-story facility, multi-million building. It sits on 4.5 or 4,500 square meters, comprising 5 dissection rooms, each able to accommodate 6 bodies for autopsy with plenty of space to avoid cross-contamination of evidence. They are specialized laboratory facilities. In addition to the molecular lab, we have the osteology lab, odontology lab, entomology lab, toxicology, and histopathology, along with neuropathology. It's incredible. It's built so that there are multiple demarcation areas. So the administrative floor does not communicate, at least contaminate the laboratory space. And the building is, you will see what I mean when I show you the video. My time is up. I'm going to leave that slide there and move on to the video that I compiled, so you'll get to see the photographs of the molecular lab. Because of time limitations, I was not able to accommodate the entire facility. And in that video, you will hear the narration from Associate Professor Laura Heathfield, who will be the manager for the molecular lab. I just want to say before Vanessa, if I may, one of the things that I am extremely proud of, and this is Laura's baby, is a piece of equipment that is currently sitting in the UCT Division of Forensic Medicine and Toxicology in the molecular lab, and it will be transferred to the OFB. That has been instrumental in fully identifying the remains that were recovered from sea, from different areas of the sea in Cape Town on 2 different days, where a technique of massively parallel sequencing was able to fully identify the deceased remains. And because of that success of that case, and it being a novel finding, the case has been recently published. So certainly, along with great infrastructure, excellent team of different professionals with an attachment to UCT and phenomenal equipment, absolutely well-renowned researchers, we are in for a great service, and especially something that will attend to our unidentified bodies. So without further ado, I wanted to speak a little bit to the Victim Identification Board, but we can do that during the panel discussion. I'll let the video run.
To show you the sample workflow in the Molecular Forensics Laboratory, which is part of the new Observatory Forensic Pathology Institute. Biological samples, including blood, bones, teeth, nails, swabs, and others, will be submitted to the laboratory and entered through the lobby. Samples will then be passed through a hatch into the specimen reception room. Here, samples will be officially logged onto the Laboratory Information Management System, or LIMS, and sorted according to sample type. After accessioning, samples will be passed through one of 2 hatches. The first is into the Evidence Recovery Lab, and these samples will require prior testing, such as identification of body fluids or recovery of subsidiary evidence from a larger evidence item. Otherwise, samples are sent from the reception area directly into the DNA extraction lab. Once samples have also been prepared in the evidence recovery lab, these 2 will be passed through a hatch into the DNA extraction lab. And as the name suggests, in the DNA extraction lab, samples will have DNA isolated from them. This may take on different forms and processes depending on the sample type, and specifically hard tissues will undergo an overnight demineralization and lysis in a dedicated laboratory space within this larger DNA extraction lab. After the DNA is prepared, it will be passed through a hatch into the PCR amplification lab. But let's just hang tight for a few minutes, because in parallel, in the clean room, a master mix of reagents will be prepared and allotted into a 96 plate. And this plate, containing just the master mix, will also enter the PCR amplification lab via a hatch. And it is within this space, the PCR amplification lab, that the DNA samples are added into the wells of the plate containing master mix. In the PCR amplification lab, either a real-time PCR will be conducted to quantify DNA, but also conventional PCR will take place as part of the DNA profiling process. After DNA quantification, that plate is discarded, but the results are analyzed. But once the PCR DNA profiling is complete, that plate will be passed through the hatch into the post-PCR analysis lab. Post-PCR fragments will be separated out using electrophoresis, and if uninformative results are obtained, perhaps due to degradation, or if a molecular autopsy is actually required, then massively parallel sequencing will take place also in the post-PCR lab. This will involve library preparation as well as sequencing. I'd just like to also note that I've helped to design this lab in such a way that it can accommodate up to 4 workflows, 2 of which are manual and 2 of which are automated. And all passes through these hatches are recorded by scanning of a barcode on the sample packaging or the tube or the plate, and also integrated with the LIMS. All the results from these analyses are exported from the instruments and analyzed using specialized software, but tertiary analyses and statistics are carried out in a separate office space by analysts. This information to assist in the identification process is used with results from other laboratories in the OFP, such as that from the anthropology unit, as well as from the post-mortem findings, which would document secondary identifiers such as scars and tattoos. I hope you've enjoyed listening to this presentation, and I'll be available.
Thank you, Tumi. Is that the conclusion? Did we have any other photographs of the other parts of the lab?
There are, but we could not fit them into the presentation because of time limitation. We only have 15 minutes.
Oh, okay. So maybe what we do during the panel discussion, is it just photographs? Maybe we can, because I'm sure people would have loved to have seen that as well. Is it a video of the?
So the video that is loaded, it is separated, does not have the photographs, but it just basically narrates the floor plan. The additional photographs I have not loaded. But
Okay, so what we'll do during lunch is that we'll add them in, and then maybe just after the panel or during the panel, we can add those photographs as well so that you can see. I'm sure everyone would love to see them. Thank you so much. Thank you for the presentation. Lorna, would you like to say a few words about your lab or add anything since you're here? Thank you, Tumi. This is Professor Lorna Martin.
Thanks. Thanks, Vanessa. And Jona, thank you. It's been a very long journey. In fact, Bonnie was just saying to me just now, ever since she's met me, which was quite a long time ago, this is all I've been talking about. So we're almost there. So hopefully by the end of this year, we'll be in with all of our processes. So it is a phenomenal achievement. And I'm really, really lucky that I have these young, enterprising scientists and pathologists to take over to run this place for us. So thank you to everybody.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Lorna. It's a great job. Is it true, Lorna, that I think you told me many years ago that Patricia Cornwall is a friend of yours and that she derives a lot of her material from your mortuary? That is a true story, I'm sure. Tumi, I think this is your phone. Is it? Oh. So we're going to go straight into the panel. If the panelists will just come up here. And we're going to be exploring strategies to identify the deceased in DVI cases. So we have Stephen Fonseca, Tumi, you're back up, Ryan Blumenthal, you're here, and Catherine Smith. Laura, I don't know if you'd like to join, just because you've done so much research, this publication was yours. I don't know if you'd like to join the panel as well in terms of strategies to identify the deceased. You're welcome to take the other seat if you're here. Thanks. Tumi, come. Just sit up on the panel. Have you got enough microphones?
Yes, ma'am.
So something we haven't spoken a lot about is technology and AI. So I'm not sure which one of you would like to answer this, possibly Tumi, Ryan, Catherine. Can technology and artificial intelligence help forensic investigators work smarter instead of harder? Because you've just shown us how hard you work with regards to the numbers that go through your mortuaries. And do you have any ideas or solutions in this regard?
Well, AI is a new tool that we have to use. And the way we're thinking about AI is, I mean, there's two basic types of questions on the planet. There are questions where there are answers, and there's questions where there's no answers. So if I ask you, for example, what's the circumference of the Earth, there's an answer. If I ask you if there's a God, I don't know. So I think 50% of AI will be correct, and 50% will be guessing. However, at my university, University of Pretoria, we are urged to use AI. And I think as researchers and academics, we have to use this tool to get the best possible data that humankind has got to offer.
Tumi, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, I have to agree with Prof. Blumenthal. There is a place for AI, and especially because we do both operational work, research, and teaching. And therefore, one has to explore where would AI be applicable. There is now, the current buzzword is GPT, which is apparently going to replace all teachers and lecturers. And I don't think that that is true. Yes, we are currently considering those options, and we are investigating where the flaws are before we can implement it completely. But that's one thing is for sure, forensic pathologists cannot be replaced. We still remain the ground truth for postmortem radiology. CT scans, MRIs, DNA analysis cannot give you the exact finding that, that the human eye will give you. And therefore, yes, there is a place for it, but there are limitations.
Catherine? Yes.
Maybe I can just add something to that from the perspective of visual identification. So I spoke a little bit yesterday about some challenges and affordances of AI, and I certainly think that our work in the forensic facial imaging space will be greatly accelerated once we can get the basic technology right. But there's AI is a very broad church. Some people think there is no such thing as artificial intelligence. And just to reiterate the point that Tumi's made is whether we're talking about forensic facial recognition, so that's the facial analysis and comparison side, where there's a lot of machine learning that's encouraged in that space, and that's a much more regulated environment than the forensic facial imaging, which is making faces from skeletal remains or photographs. I've just lost my point now. Is that my point is that, like Tumi said, the optimal arrangement is human plus computer in collaboration. So the computer is not at the point of replacing the human yet. The human examiner is still essential to make a final judgment.
No, for sure. Stephen, the major challenges that you face, you're in the field a lot, in the process of identifying the deceased in DVI. The cases, do they differ, the challenges in the various disaster scenarios? Maybe you could talk to that, because again, we spoke about a subjective approach here. There's no one fits all. So your interpretation of that?
Yeah, sure. So the science is certainly not the problem. I think we've been lucky that we investigate in a world where we've got such advancement in science. The challenge for us is finding something to compare. And if we look at and we have to accept that the unidentified bodies in South Africa is a mass fatality incident. It is a disaster. It exceeds the resources and to respond effectively. So when we look at that, the one big void in that whole process is that there's nothing to compare against, because the families don't actually have a conduit from outside of South Africa to actually support the process, the identification process. So when we look at closed cases like an aeroplane crash, you have a manifest, you have people who you reasonably believe were on the plane, you've got something to actually target. A lot of the disasters that we're dealing with today, especially with climate change, are large-scale, protracted, widespread, open disasters. And we need people to come forward to tell us who the dead are. Without that, we cannot rely only on databases. Most countries in Africa don't have fingerprint databases, let's be honest. So it requires so much human involvement, and that is actually the families. And then the authorities, the system is often malfunctioning. So you might have a great pathology service, you might have one or two elements in the process that are really, really good and advanced. Then you've got some elementary problems with chain of custody or poor investigative skills when you're meeting the families, that type of thing. So I don't think the science is so much of the challenge. I think the people are the challenge for us in disasters.
Laura, maybe the advancements in DNA analysis, and we've certainly seen a few over the last course of the last 2 days. What new opportunities have emerged for enhancing identification in deceased and DVI cases? And maybe you could also talk to the potential limitations, just as Steve has done, or ethical considerations that are associated with these advancing technologies.
Right. So I think the past 2 days have covered a lot of the new advancements. Prof. Bruce has gone through massively parallel sequencing and phenotyping. Catherine's also given us some insight into some of the limitations and the way we interpret that data. So I would say, in addition to these things that have already been discussed, new areas would be microbial research, and analyzing microbiomes from touch DNA, and to kind of trace people based on what they've touched, but not with touch DNA, but through microbial analysis. And another advancement is swabbing or taking a sample of body fluids and analyzing the protein, which might be a bit more stable, and then working backwards from the protein sequence to the DNA sequence. So I would say those are new technologies or methods. And as with all new methods, they need to be thoroughly researched and have good reference data to enable their correct interpretation. Kind of touching on the ethical issues, I think there is an ethical issue just with the databases, and it's also been a theme that's been spoken about, is really the separation of the missing persons and unidentified human remains index. And I think promoting people to come forward, it might ease their mind to not be on the same database, even if it's their perception, you know, to kind of encourage people to come forward.
Can I add to
As
that?
what said, you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really excellent point. And we've had a number of discussions with academic institutions more recently about the fact that, and we go back to migrants, who, if you're an irregular migrant, coming forward means exposing yourself to arrest and deportation. Yet we have so many unidentified bodies in the mortuary. So the authorities want those bodies identified, but they close the door to the people who can provide the information to help them identify the cases. So with digital technology today, we hope that we can work with academic institutions in South Africa and then in Africa to create that anonymous conduit, at least at this point, so that people who fear coming forward still have an avenue to help with that identification process, to report someone missing, and probably more importantly, to report crimes that might not necessarily be investigated, but for reporting purposes, it's really important. How many times are migrant women sexually assaulted? Even if it's not investigated, it's important to know that they are a victim, that they're vulnerable, that this is a very serious issue. But without any reporting, it's really hard to know the extent of the problem and then to find the right support for it. Thank you.
I think maybe before you answer this, and it could impact the answer, Ryan, or the others, is that, you know, we're speaking very much about access to advances in technology, but we find that in disasters, they often occur in countries which have very little access to these advanced technologies. And the circumstances of the disaster are literally impossible in terms of just location and access. So any sort of thoughts, given what we've just spoken, in terms of how to address that in a more holistic way?
I mean, look, I'm just a lone worker in the trenches, you know, I'm not in management, you know, but you've got to be pragmatic. This is the key. And let me tell you, it's not just specifically about mass disasters. I mean, you can get a body that's dismembered, that's thrown down the river in 38 pieces. I mean, are we going to do DNA on every single piece, or are we going to be pragmatic and like try to put it like together like a jigsaw puzzle and see that this is actually one person, thereby saving money? Can you practice good medicine with peanuts? Can you practice good medicine in a resource-limited and resource-depleted environment? I mean, you've also got to think about practical solutions. Just getting back to your plane crash. I mean, let me ask you a tough question. What if I were to tell you that we're no longer offering you plane tickets, but dog tags? Would you be comfortable to wear a dog ticket, like they do in the army, you know? Because that would help us. You know, I don't know how many plane crashes you've been to, but it's nasty. You know, there's little pieces everywhere, and you know that could save a lot of trouble, just practically. But I mean, how comfortable would you be to put on a necklace when you get on a plane? So at the end of the day, we've got to be practical. We will find African solutions for global problems. I think there's like a lot of wisdom in the old-fashioned detective with the pencil behind his ear that like literally solves the case with, you know, just old school fashion with the senses, you know, sight, smell, taste. Well, not taste, but
I was about to ask.
But you know. You do what you can with what you got where you are, because that's the principles of like wilderness medicine, and you do the best that you can, and then as an adjunct, you come to DNA. And I think it's once you've exhausted all possible resources that you go to the next level.
May I add that when we meet with governments, I often get asked for a DNA database. And the question I have for them is, what system would accommodate your DNA database? A lot of the time, there isn't even a single plan written for the management of the dead in a disaster. And that country experiences disasters every single year, and there still is no plan, mass fatality plan. So before you start shooting for advanced techniques, let's get down to the basics of understanding what your resources are, how you would deploy them on a day-to-day basis. Let's not shoot for the disaster response right now. Let's see how you're doing everything on a daily basis, because that's what you will rely on in a large-scale event. You're just not going to miraculously somehow come up with another 50 pathologists tomorrow. So that's the problem that we often see, is we're always thinking advancements in technology and science is going to resolve the problem when we've missed the basics out of actually having a pen and a piece of paper and writing down a plan, which people think it's a lot of hard work. Well, yes, it is. You've got to actually think about it for a while. But it's not expensive to write a plan. It's very expensive to launch a lab in a functional system.
Thanks, Stephen. A great question here from the online audience. It's Ria Theodosi. I don't know where you're from. I have asked wherever you are out there, where you're from. As forensic pathologists and forensic officers, you use various resources to assist in the identification of bodies, which you just alluded to, sexual crimes, gunshot residues, collection of tissues. Are the current evidence collection kits used efficient and effective to your needs? And if not, how can these kits be improved? How can this happen? And who needs to be part of these discussions? And just before, maybe Tumi, you can start with answering it. I know that Innocent is going to present on a global donation project where we donate items from unused sexual assault kits. The cost of kits is so huge. The kits seem to have unending numbers of items in them, and we don't have the resources to process every single one. So yeah, any comment, maybe Tumi, Ryan, and I'm not sure if the others got in response to, collection kits. Tumi?
If I can just start, Vanessa, by highlighting the issue of communication, which was also highlighted by I think the lady from Mauritius, Asha. And I think Nahama as well, that we need to learn how to communicate with each other so that we understand what each other person in that team is doing. When we are expected at the mortuary to use a sexual assault evidence collection kit, or otherwise known as a safe kit in Zim, you have to understand that the clinical setup of a living person is different from the setup at the mortuary. When I'm at the mortuary, I want to collect all the evidence before that body is buried. And therefore, if you give me a kit that is otherwise happens to be available and is the only kit that can be provided by the lab, and the specs do not fit the purpose in the mortuary, then we have a problem. So what I'm saying is it's important for the laboratories to always engage with the end users when the specifications of these types of kits are produced.
100%.
So my answer to this would be, architects build buildings to impress other architects. Anesthetic machines are built by those that don't use the anesthetic machine. And, there's two types of thinking also. There's lumpers and splitters. There's people that want minimalism and efficiency and simplicity, and then there's people that want like multiple divisions of a kit. If you take the pediatric sexual assault kit and the adult sexual assault kit, the difference is the size of the swab, but the costs for two different kits, can we not, for example, combine with smaller swabs, for example? Or something like that, just to to stop wastage, and also our workload is extreme. You want to get in there, get the best data, get out. Others are going to burn out. So we have to somehow think smarter, find out where the best bang for buck is. Go for the money. The main thing is to keep the main thing. So get in there, get your data, get out. Fingernail clippings is the will o' the wisp of forensic medicine. How many hits do we get, as compared to a deep vaginal swab or something? So we need to see where the evidence is, and especially in a limited resource environment, we have to think smartly.
Great, thanks. Yes, Aaron, question.
Thanks. So just a quick one. I think my question is for Stephen. So back on 3rd June 2015 in my country, Ghana, there was a fire and flood incident where around 150 people lost their lives. And my question is, from a humanitarian perspective, what resources are available to assist nations in such situations to help in identifying individuals?
Did you hear the last part of that?
Yeah, just that last.
Yeah, so my question was, what resources from a humanitarian perspective are available to assist nations in identifying people in such disasters? Yeah.
So the quick answer is, what do you have on site? Because a humanitarian organization, and it's not just the ICRC, it'll be another humanitarian organization, if they were committed to help you, they're not going to be there today. So it depends what phase of the response you would need assistance with. So again, this goes back to planning. We would never bring pathologists because they need to be licensed in your country to perform medical procedures. So you would always have to develop that capacity in-house. The logistics, where are you going to store bodies until the humanitarian army arrives? You know, so the planning really is about discussing that. What can you do locally, provincially, nationally? What does your military offer in terms of additional resources? And then where do you start looking regionally and internationally? It's hard for an international organization, including the ICRC, to suddenly get a visa overnight and send people to the country. And then when we arrive, how long does it take for our equipment to be approved by customs and then finally deployed? And so we go through all of that when we are talking about planning. There are resources, but the whole point is the country needs to start developing a base capacity, and it's about engaging the lab. So if you've got 150 people that are burned or have been recovered out of water, you may need to use DNA. What is, the tabletop exercises help you deal with the fact that, oh boy, we're in trouble. We should have asked the DNA laboratory what happens if we suddenly want to drop 150 cases on by Friday, and we want this identification immediately, because families are bashing down the mortuary door at that point. They want their bodies back now. And so it becomes very problematic. So I don't have a quick answer, only to say is we need to engage with the state to build the capacity. And that happens by basic day-to-day casework. So you build the expertise and the resources.
Thanks, Stephen. Yeah. Any other questions? Yes. Anthony, maybe you guys can help with the speakers here. I think there might be another one up there. Thanks.
Thank you, Vanessa. My question is both to Stephen and Ryan. Recently, Interpol, the DVI working group, released sort of a new DVI guide. I just wanted you to reflect on that, on your comments, to say to what extent does identification go? I believe that with 195 countries being members of that organization, there are set standards that maybe when we go forward, we need to be saying, all of us try to comply with this, so that we set our national sort of structures centered around that particular standard. Your comment, please.
Yeah, sure. Excuse me. Yeah, sure, I can comment on that. Obviously, the form is excellent, but actually completing it is difficult. So if anybody's been to a plane crash, as you say, and you've got thousands of bits and pieces of human beings, people, and you've got this very huge document that you're now trying to complete, it's going to start raining in the next 2 hours, or a fire is moving closer. If there's just so many other environmental variables that when you're trying to fill some of these fields in, it isn't always realistic. So then you decide to do it later, but now that body's now moving through another process. So I totally agree that standardization and centralization does require reporting on the same form, and we should all try and conform to these types of forms. But we don't know who's necessarily responding. And so, the ICRC has a different form for community responders because they don't have the skills to fill out that form, and they're not qualified to fill out that form, quite frankly. So we try to find out who's actually responding and what is reasonable in terms of the information being collected, in the hope that the expert will then have more opportunity and be in a clinical environment to capture the other documentation. So I'll stop there.
Thanks. Would anyone else like to add any other? Oh, there's a question, Billy. I can hear you.
Now, sorry. I just want to ask Tuli if you can explain that identification group and which members are in that identification group, and how do you determine then to release somebody to a family? For instance, a migrant comes and do identification, and there's descriptions. How do you decide then to keep that body or release it?
Did you all hear that this side? Okay. They heard.
Thanks for the question, Billy. So what we have embarked on at Sword River, and it's a process that is going to be fully implemented in the OFB, is that we have decided to create a victim identification board. The stakeholders in the board will be the police, the forensic science lab, us as forensic pathology service with a facility manager directly involved, but also perhaps one of the pathologists, but also the lab managers. In addition, we are going to have some meetings where we are going to involve NGOs. So in Cape Town, we have an NGO called Pink Ladies, and the community goes to that NGO whenever they have a missing family member. And therefore, it's important for us to understand how we can work together, because they've got the media platform to communicate with communities via Facebook, Twitter, which is something that we at the mortuary don't do. But when we have those stakeholders coming together, we are then able to revisit the process as we have now. Yes, we have access to primary and secondary identifiers on our unidentified bodies form, but the scientific methods, we still need to do a monitoring and evaluation, and as a group decide what actually works, and for the methods that do not work, why is it that they're not working? A very good example is in my many years of working in a clinical forensic service and forensic pathology, I've only seen one DNA report, only one. I don't know what I've been doing wrong. There is no communication from the forensic science lab as to why some of their profiles are partial, contaminated, or full profile. There is no. So we keep on taking these specimens in this case, but we have no idea whatsoever what we are doing wrong. Similarly, for rape homicides, we have a process at Sword River where we will admit the body, not put it in the fridge, and put it out for fuming to try and lift fingerprints. But we've had no report whatsoever as to what the success rate of that is. The reason we do it is because we are driven by pathology. And therefore, when I examine a rape homicide, I want to make sure that I collect all the evidence that I can possibly collect. However, if the lab uses other processes, then I could just be wasting my time and their time and resources. So the Victim Identification Board is to facilitate that process where we can work together much more closely, learn from each other. One other unique characteristic of this board is that it allows for continuous professional education, which is a two-way process. So we will learn from forensic science personnel. Equally, they will learn from us as pathologists, but also learn from the researchers. Laura will be one of the personnel, and in fact, one of the things that we are currently doing to establish the board is that we're going through a memorandum of understanding with SAPS. And I know that, Vanessa, we have already consulted you on the legal aspects of that MOU. It's just so that we can start off with analyzing what we're doing, track, have a monitoring system of some sort, but also for the results that we are able to obtain, create a registry our own mortuary registry. That's how you start a database, isn't it? You start by recording your findings, and that way you can eliminate cases where you are successful, keep the ones that are, because at the moment, those 400 numbers year on year, we actually do not know, actually, for the ones that we're able to identify positively, what methods were actually successful. So we need to have a place where we are going to collate all of that information, and that will inform the way forward and definitely lead to much better success.
I think it's actually a good presentation to maybe look at for next year. I would really love to see the results of that. I don't know if SAPS want to respond to that, but it seems like you must have SAPS on the board.
Yes, we do.
Okay, so these have been, would you like to respond to that? Because I think a direct response may be short, because I know people are.
To me, there are two things here. If it's an unknown and you collect tissue samples, we are not going to report per se because we don't have anything to compare it to. We will keep that sample in the database. If we are able to obtain a DNA profile, it will go into the database, as all single profiles will do. So we are not necessarily going to report back to you as from forensic pathology on what we get. Also remember that VIC will maybe hand in that sample. It will be into the laboratory. It will get the registration, the lab number, so it will go a different route. If there is a criminal offense and you take a sexual certificate, a seek from the victim, and it goes through the normal route, then that report will go to the investigating officer, or it will be available on our ICDMS, which can be accessed. Once again, that report will not necessarily go back to you. So if it's something that you guys need to have a look at, then we can change it. And we can change our way of reporting, where we only maybe report to VIC, that we only also report to you guys as well. So if there's a need, we can look at it.
That just seemed like communication right there. We're getting close to lunch. I think everybody, Joe wants to respond. Okay, can you keep it short so that we... Oh, you've got a microphone there, thanks.
Thank you, Vanessa. I'm also from the quality management component, and what is very important is the interested party. I think we've taken note from the customer, so I'll be speaking to my colleagues in the quality. We need to see what customer feedback response, and I think that is the crux that we need to develop and have some sort of communicate back to the customer. And this is one of the interested parties that have been neglected. I need to acknowledge that.
Great. I think everybody's ready for a stretch and some lunch, am I right? This has been a really great session, and thank you to the panelists for your expertise and for contributing to this.
Bottom line is,
I really do hope the discussions continue over lunch because, as you say, communication is key. We'll see you back at what time? 2 o'clock. If you can make it at 2 o'clock, that'll be great for the quality assurance session. Thank you.